Hello and good day to everyone. FACTS Talk Podcast is back, and we are thrilled to welcome you to a new series called Bantay Dagat, the role of the Maritime Zones Law in protecting and harnessing the Philippines' maritime domain. The series is made possible through the collaboration between FACTS Asia and the Waypoints Project, with support from the Australian government. I'm RJ Parcon, your host for this series. With half of the population residing in coastal regions, the water have long been deeply ingrained in Philippine identity. While the Philippines ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea 42 years ago and enacted the Philippine Archipelagic Baselines Law 15 years ago, the Philippines has not been able to codify the country's maritime zones until recently. The signing of the Maritime Zones Act and the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has been truly groundbreaking, especially for a country with a deeply rooted history in its waters. The signing of these two new laws are both symbolic and foundational. But what do these mean and signify for the Philippines? This Bantay Dagat podcast will delve into these new laws. Bantay Dagat, or Citizen Sea Patrol, reflects the collective responsibility of protecting the Philippine seas. For the inaugural session of the Bantay Dagat series, we're honored to have with us Dr. J. Batongbacal. Professor Batongbacal is a lawyer with degrees in political science and law from the University of the Philippines, as well as Master of Marine Management and Doctor in the Science of Law, both from Dalhousie University. At present, he is a full professor at the University of the Philippines College of Law and serves as director of the Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea of the UP Law Center. Hello and welcome to FACTS Talk Podcast Bantay Dagat series, Dr. J. Batongbacal.
Hi, good day to you and to all our viewers.
Prof. J, thank you very much for joining us today. And before I touch on some specific questions about the Maritime Zones Act, and we have quite a few on the list, we want to know more about you. You've been in the space I've mentioned earlier since 1997. So my question, sir, is what fuels your commitment and passion towards maritime law and maritime governance?
Oh wow, that's a tough question. But really, it's been a long-standing interest and advocacy of mine ever since law school. Actually, when I first wrote about coastal zone management as part of my graduation requirements at the UP College of Law. So I've always had an interest in the sea and policy and legal reforms for our maritime sectors, no, and for our marine resources. So since 97, after I got my Master of Marine Management degree, I've basically been working on it, no? All different fields, everything from coastal and fishery resource management by local communities, all the way up to discussions of national boundaries and even international issues such as high seas fishing, no, and seafaring. You could say that my career has basically revolved around the maritime field, and so it's so naturally issues like this on the maritime zones and archipelagic sea lanes are an essential part of it.
That is truly inspiring, Prof. J. And as you've mentioned, no, you've been in all levels from local, national, and international. So surely with your vast experience, you saw numerous developments in the maritime area. And that brings us to our discussion today. Today, we will discuss the key provisions of the new Maritime Zones Act, which was recently signed, and its impact on maritime security, environmental protection, and the blue economy. This is also because we see the Maritime Zones Act as a foundational policy for the Philippines. So to start off, I think it's really apt for us to ask the question, would it be possible for you, Prof. J, to give us an overview of the Philippine Maritime Zones Act and its key provisions?
The Philippine Maritime Zone Act essentially contains the parameters for defining what we call the maritime zones of the country. These are the areas of the sea around the Philippines, and based on these areas, as defined by the law, we are able to exercise specific types of authority and jurisdiction over all the activities that are taking place there, no? And the system of maritime zones is consistent with the system that is recognized under international law. So because of that recognition, other nations are also committed and bound to recognize the exercise of the Philippines, of its powers and authorities in each one of these maritime zones. No? And this is how we're able, therefore, to get their cooperation, no, in the management of our waters.
Thank you very much, Prof. J. You've mentioned that it's crucial. The Maritime Zones Act is crucial for defining the maritime zones of the country, which is recognized by international law and other countries. But Prof. J, let me ask a question also. Why is there a need to actually pass legislation focused on the maritime zones of the Philippines? Aren't the Constitution and even the arbitral award sufficient to define the Philippines' maritime zones?
Well, the Constitution and the South China Sea Arbitration Award lays the basis for the law. No? But they fall a bit short in the sense that prior to the 1987 Constitution and prior to the South China Sea Arbitration in 2016, there were already some existing laws dating back to the 1960s, some of them even to the 1950s, which established maritime zones unilaterally and were not in accord with what is accepted and recognized by the international community. So even if the Philippines had insisted that it was going to abide by international law, the reality was, as a civil law country, we needed to pass laws in order to make our legal system and these old laws in order to make them consistent with international law. So amendments were required, revisions were required in our laws to do that. And in the case of one maritime zone, for example, the contiguous zone, there was no prior law on it. So we needed to create that, no, by enacting a law again. So that's why there was a need to revise the previous system, no, correct any inconsistencies, and also create new norms or new rules in order to put in place new developments, no, that took place since then. No? And that's why we now have a Maritime Zone Act. It wasn't an easy thing to do because the maritime zone bills had been pending since 1996, if I'm not mistaken. No? So it took decades for us to reach that point where we were now finally able to pass a Maritime Zone Act. And that's why it's very significant, no, that it really is a measure, no, or indication of this long-standing commitment of the Philippines to bring its laws in line with the norms of international law.
And with what you've mentioned, Professor J, it actually brought me back also to what President Marcos mentioned during the signing of the bill. He mentioned that the Maritime Zones Acts actually took numerous congresses to have it passed, no? And this is a very welcomed development in the area of maritime security and maritime governance, especially for the Philippines. With what you've mentioned, Prof. J, the Maritime Zones Act really is a foundational policy. So it doesn't really just determine the needs and bounds of the Philippine maritime domain, but it does so much more. In your perspective, Prof, how does the Philippine Maritime Zones Act actually contribute to securing the Philippine maritime domain? And I guess with this question, maybe you can also put focus on the importance of the maritime zones in helping our maritime law enforcement agencies in fulfilling their mandates.
Well, we look at it from two perspectives. One is from the national perspective. It's very important. As you mentioned, it's foundational. It lays the basis for defining the maritime jurisdictions of the country, no? With respect to our inter-island waters, as well as the waters outside of the archipelago, no? By putting in place the maritime zones in accordance with UNCLOS, we are actually exercising the sovereignty and jurisdiction to which we're entitled to under international law. So by exercising this jurisdiction, we can therefore then improve our own management, you know, of our marine areas. So everything from, say, the Fisheries Code to the Mining Act, no, the environment laws, insofar as they apply to the seas beyond the shore of any one of our islands, no, then the Maritime Zone Act is the first thing you look at, no, because it will tell you the extent of power and authority that the state can exercise in any specific location in the water anywhere around our islands. So in the inter-island waters or the archipelagic waters, as it is known in international law, we have full sovereignty And therefore we can do anything that we want with that, with the waters there, and we have absolute control over all activities there, subject only to permitting foreign vessels to pass through. No, as long as that's the only thing they're doing, passing through, not doing anything else like interfering with our fishing or offloading cargo or smuggling or even fishing and conducting marine scientific research. That's no longer just passing through, no? The exploitation of our resources. So within our archipelagic waters, we have absolute and total sovereignty. We can prevent that and we can take actions against vessels that violate that. This extends to the 12 nautical mile territorial sea around our archipelago and archipelagic waters because the territorial sea is also subject to our sovereignty. Okay. Now, beyond the territorial sea, all the way up to 200 nautical miles, that is our exclusive economic zone and continental shelf. No? The exclusive economic zone refers to the waters. The continental shelf refers to the seabed underneath. So in these areas, we no longer have absolute and complete sovereignty, but we do have sovereign rights over all the natural resources there. And therefore, we can do whatever is needed in order to explore, exploit, and protect and manage those natural resources. And when you think about it, that already covers a lot, no, of the things that can happen in those areas. And that happens to be most important for us as a developing country because when it comes to the area of the sea, no, our sea areas are something like I think around 80% of the total areas under the jurisdiction of the Philippines, no? Whereas our land area is only around 300,000 square kilometers, no? The sea areas can reach up to 2.2 million square kilometers, no? So you can see how big it is, no? And therefore, our rights to our natural resources within our waters is the most important aspect, no, of our being an archipelagic country, no? So the Maritime Zone Act essentially establishes, no, our authorities over these waters. And it does so in a way that is consistent with international law naman. So that's the second perspective. From the international law perspective, since these are established in accordance with UNCLOS, that means that other countries are bound, no, they're obligated to comply with Philippine laws and regulations when it comes to these maritime zones. No? So with respect to the exercise of sovereignty within archipelagic and territorial seas, and with respect to our exercise of jurisdiction over natural resources, they have to follow us. They have to comply with our rules. They have to respect our rights. No? And that's how we are therefore able to get their cooperation, no, in the implementation and enforcement of our laws. So in this way, the nations of the world have decided to allocate, no, among all of the nations, their rights to the marine areas, to the oceanic resources across the world. No? So that's how it works.
Thank you, Prof. J, for that very clear explanation of how the Maritime Zones Act can actually help us in terms of improving the Philippine maritime governance. No, sir, I would like to focus on what you've mentioned earlier, that the Philippines can actually take action on violators, and that other countries are bound to respect the Philippines' maritime zones and respect our rights, basically. No, this brings me to my next question, Prof. J. Because we also took a look at the Maritime Zones Act and we saw that there was a provision, particularly Section 13, no? It discussed the importance of due regard and mutual respect. Can you further explain, Prof. J, the importance of this provision and how can this actually be applied?
Yes, this is possibly the most important provision of the law outside of the maritime zones themselves, no? Due regard and mutuality, these are important obligations. No, it is mentioned even in the Law of the Sea Convention. No, due regard means that all states must give each other what is due to them, the respect and deference to their respective jurisdictions. No? So while the Philippines has rights in its marine areas, other countries may also have certain rights that are applicable, no, such as the right to pass through, as I mentioned. Or the right to conduct other legitimate activities, no? And that depends on the maritime zone that we're talking with, no? That we're talking about, no? So due regard requires them basically to treat each other with respect, no? It is like the golden rule, no? You do unto others what you want them to do unto you, basically, but in an international sense, no? So due regard is a principle that that highlights the mutual obligations of the parties to respect each other's jurisdiction and authority. No? Mutuality is another principle. This means that both parties, no, the Philippines and other states, external states, no, must also act in a way that not only respects each other, no, which is due regard, but also in a way that commits them both to the same obligations, the same duties and obligations. They're equal in other respects. Okay, and therefore, when it comes especially to the implementation of international law like UNCLOS, no, mutuality is what enables the Philippines to demand that other parties, if they wish to be respected in the exercise of their rights in our waters, then they should also respect the Philippines' rights, no? In their waters or elsewhere in the high seas. No? This is very important for us, especially since we know that there are certain nations, no, that seem to consider themselves above the law, no, while they demand that we, for example, recognize their rights in our waters. They do not recognize our rights. No? So mutuality seeks to equalize that situation. No? If they do not respect our rights, no, if they do not recognize our rights, then we have every right to do the same to them, meaning that we will not respect the rights that they demand of us. There should be reciprocity, that it is a two-way street. No? So that's how it works. And we hope that this will enable the government, no, both the present and future governments, to have that option, no, of also taking action, no, and even sanctioning these other countries that abuse their rights in our waters. No? So by invoking this provision, no, on due regard and mutuality.
Thanks, Prof. J. I just want to clarify, sir, no, with what you mentioned. So countries must act in a way that's respectful of each other, and you've mentioned that there are non-Filipino vessels in our EEZ. So I just want to further expound on this, sir. So the Maritime Zones Act can actually be utilized, and the MZA can actually further facilitate our maritime agencies.
Yes,
right,
yes,
sir?
because actually one of the biggest problems we've had, no, for quite a long time, arising from the inconsistency between what we unilaterally claimed, no, back in the 50s and 60s and what was contained in the Law of the Sea Convention, is that they did not actually coincide. No? And so there was a lot of confusion and even hesitation on the part of our maritime law enforcement agencies in the conduct of maritime law enforcement and security operations because of the uncertainty whether they would, for example, apply the domestic law, no, and the unilateral claims of the Philippines, or international law. And in cases where these two may clash, no, unfortunately, in order to play it safe, perhaps, no, then the agencies probably would not carry out the law enforcement, no, just to be safe. No? And so that led to a lot of problems because that meant that the effectiveness of our law enforcement agents at sea was impeded by these inconsistencies. No? Now that we have eliminated the inconsistencies, it now becomes clear to the law enforcement agencies exactly what are the boundaries, no? What are the extents of their powers and jurisdictions. And it will also clarify what specific powers and jurisdictions are now going to be applicable in specific places. All they need to do is find out which maritime zone they are located in. No? The Maritime Zone Act will now then tell them what they can or cannot do in those particular places, no, in those particular instances. So that helps make our maritime law enforcement operations more effective. No, it also will rationalize the conduct of these law enforcement operations because you now have a better idea, or how much effort rather you can expend, no, in exercising a particular authority, no, and up to where you can exercise that, no. It also will help our government agencies in the day-to-day management of these areas, no, because they'll now have a better idea of how much space it is that they need to, for example, patrol, or they can put a monetary figure now to how much resources are required in order for them to conduct regular operations in this entire area. No, so very mundane things like budgeting and planning for operations is a bit clearer now because of the Maritime Zone Act.
Thank you for that very clear explanation once again, Prof. J. No, Prof. While also reading the Maritime Zones Act, the bill, the arbitral award has been mentioned. No, and how do you think how crucial is mentioning the arbitral award in a legislation such as this?
Well, actually, it's very important because it is in itself an implementation of the award. There have been people who have been challenging the award, and they've been actually been spreading misinformation that favors China, saying that the award cannot be enforced, that there's no implementation. Well, the fact that the Maritime Zone Act actually mentions it and implements the rights of the Philippines, establishes the maritime zones in a way that is consistent with the award, that in itself is already an implementation of the South China Sea arbitration. So really, it was essential for us to be able to mention that award because this shows clearly the Philippines demonstrating that it is actually implementing the award. And when it carries out maritime law enforcement, therefore, it is also enforcing the essence of the award.
Thank you, Prof. J. And as you've mentioned, also it's high time to clarify the importance of the arbitral award and include the importance of including it also in national legislation such as the Maritime Zones Act. This brings me also to my next question. Because there are some chatter online when it comes to the Maritime Zones Act, PD 5096, and even the Sabah claim, with some people actually saying that this may affect the Philippines claim. So, Prof. J, I'm very much interested to know your perspective on this. One, will the MZA actually affect PD 5096? And two, will it actually abandon the Philippines claim to the KIG and the Sabah?
Number one, let's make it clear. Insofar as the claims to sovereignty over the territories in these areas are concerned, that is each and every island and the high tide elevation in the Calayan Island Group and the area of Sabah, the territorial claims are not affected, no, because these are claims over land. No, the law of the sea does not apply to them, and the South China Sea arbitration does not apply to them because they're land. No, this is only about the sea. Okay, so it has no impact on the status, the legitimacy, the validity, or invalidity of the claims to sovereignty over the land territories in either the Calayan Island Group area or in Sabah. Okay, that's very clear. At best, what it does would be to reconfigure the maritime zones around the islands in the Calayan Island Group, no? Because now we're making it consistent with international law. We're applying the maritime zones in accordance with UNCLOS instead of the previous unilateral claim to absolute sovereignty over an arbitrarily drawn box. Okay, so that is also very clear. This had already been, in a way, prepared, no, even before the Maritime Zone Act. The Philippine Baselines Law, for example, RA 9522, already indicated, no, that the maritime zones around the Calayan Island Group would be drawn in accordance with UNCLOS when it mentions the application of the regime of islands. So the Maritime Zone Act actually just reiterates and clarifies it. No? And even before RA 9522, PD 5096 had already been amended actually because on the same day, in the same year as the issuance of PD 5096, we issued PD 5099, which established the Philippine EEZ. And this EEZ covers most of the Calayan Island Group area. So even if we said in PD 5096 that this arbitrarily drawn box was subject to the absolute sovereignty of the Philippines, the subsequent decree, PD 5099, amended that and established that most of these areas are actually now EEZ areas instead. Okay, so this is how it has worked out. No? So the Maritime Zone Act did not really change anything substantially with respect to the territorial claims. It only, at most, clarified the configuration of the maritime zones in accordance with UNCLOS now around the Calayan Islands.
Thank you, Prof. J. So as what you mentioned, the Maritime Zones Act merely clarified the configuration of the maritime zones in the Kalayaan Islands. Sir, that brings me to my next question. Because there are also some discussions on the overlapping EEZs, and possible delimitation. So in the Maritime Zones Act, what does it have to say about overlapping EEZs? And what are the steps to take basically in terms of delimiting those EEZs?
Well, actually, the Maritime Zone Act contains a provision about the limitations. So it keeps open the door for negotiations with our close neighbors, no, in order to delimit or divide the areas where our respective maritime zones overlap. So the EEZ and continental shelf is obvious because that's a very large area extending up to 200 nautical miles. But we can also negotiate areas such as the territorial sea, no, in places where they may overlap with the territorial sea of another country. Okay, so um, it simply keeps that door open. Okay, how it is implemented, how the negotiations are undertaken, and what final agreement will be entered into, that comes later. No? And the Maritime Zone Act does not prevent that, but in fact recognizes that it can happen in the future.
So, sir, based on what we've discussed today, it's the Maritime Zones Act does not merely clarify the metes and bounds of the Philippine maritime domain, but it actually improves the overall maritime governance of the Philippines, right? So, sir, thank you very much for joining us today, Professor J. Once again, it's really another session where I've learned valuable lessons in maritime law and security. So, before we end, Prof. J, are there any parting words on your end on the importance of the Maritime Zones Act?
All I can say at this point is that the Maritime Zone Act, as you mentioned, is foundational, but it also needs follow-up, no? Because after all, it will be implemented, and there are other laws, other maritime laws in the Philippines, such as the Fisheries Code and the Mining Act, the Petroleum Act, no, which are also applicable to the sea, and therefore their implementation will now have to account for the maritime zones and the Maritime Zone Act. So there is still a bit of work to be done now that we've harmonized our maritime zones with that of national law. It will need further refinement now in order for us to improve our maritime governance by working now on these other laws that are going to be implemented, no, in the maritime zones of the Philippines. Okay, so we're not done yet. Okay, it's just the start, really, of a much broader process of reforms in maritime governance.
So once again, thank you very much for giving us some of your time this morning, Prof. J.
Welcome, RJ, and welcome to all our viewers and listeners.
On that note, we would like to thank Dr. J. Batongbacal for a very insightful first Bantay Dagat episode, and we learned a lot today. The Maritime Zones Act is vital in clarifying the geographical extent of the maritime domain of the Philippines, in understanding the rights, obligations, and authority in each maritime zone, and in improving the overall maritime governance of the Philippines. It also promotes a more encompassing and comprehensive maritime security regime that addresses both traditional and non-traditional security threats to the Philippine waters. Indeed, based on what we discussed today, the Maritime Zones Law is necessary, beneficial, and imperative. Thank you once again for joining us here on FACTS Talk Podcast Bantay Dagat series, Professor J. Batongbacal, and thank you to all of you who joined us today. If you love and learned from this podcast, please share this episode with your friends and colleagues. I also invite you to like and follow FACTS Asia official social media accounts, facebook.com/FACTSAsia on Facebook, and at FACTSAsia.org on Twitter. You may also visit our website at www.factsasia.org to stay updated on our projects. Well, that's all for now. Again, this is your host, RJ Parcon. Until the next episode of the Bantay Dagat podcast.